Hello, I'm David, and I'd like to welcome you to this new episode of this long-term reading project on Thomas Mann's novel, The Magic Mountain. It has been quite a while. There was a break of about 3 or 4 months on this channel because I had a few challenges in my private life, and these challenges took up a lot of my free time, so I had to drastically reduce and prioritize my booktube activities here on this channel, but also on my main channel, Polyglot Reading. But now the situation has improved a little bit there. I have reached a new normal, so to say, and now I think it's safe to continue here with this project. And so I expect that I will be able to make new videos on the Magic Mountain about every 2 to 3 weeks. Okay, so where did we stop? Today we stopped at the fourth and fifth section of chapter 6. So today's video is about the sixth part of the sixth chapter. So, and this section has the title Operationes Spirituales, so which means something like spiritual operations or spiritual works. And it is one of those, the main part of this section is one of those debates between Settembrini and Naphta that are dreaded by some readers. Okay, so as usual, I would like to start by giving you a short overview of the structure of this video. So the first part of this video will be just a short summary of the plot, and I will make some notes about some structural elements that I noticed. Then the second part will be some news about Naphta. So what do we learn, or what did we learn about Naphta in this section? And the third chapter will be the largest one. It will be about the topics and the of the dispute and the positions that the two main opponents take in this dispute. And the fourth chapter will be after all this long dispute, what's the point of it all? And then in the fifth part of this video, I would like to say a little bit about what were the possible role models for Naphta. So did Thomas Mann just portray one specific person here, or did it tap from several sources? I would like to tell you a little bit more about this. And then finally there will be an outlook about the next what and when will be the content of the next video. Okay, let's start right away with the first point, the summary of the plot and some notes about the structure. In the first part of this subchapter, we learn in a kind of flashback something about the background of Leo Naphta. So we learn that this is a story of the rise of an intellectually gifted Jewish boy from a poor or modest background to a promising Jesuit pupil or scholar who unfortunately cannot become a priest due to his illness. And then there's the second part of the subject section where we learn that Hans increasingly seeks conversation with Naphta, and he is often accompanied on his walks together with Naphta. He's accompanied by Ferge, so this is the fellow patient with the traumatic surgical experience, and by Vesal, so this somewhat shady, dubious character who I find rather unsettling. And of course, also Settembrini is often part of the group as well. As a reminder, Settembrini and Naphta, they live as tenants or subtenants in the very same private house in the village of Davos. They do not live at the Burghof. They can't afford to live there. So there are subtenants in this private house. And so when you visit one of them, so you usually end up with being in the presence of both of them. And it seems that there were many walks taken by this group of five, of Hans Castorp, Mr. Ferger, Mr. Wesel, Settembrini, and Naphta. Walks always dominated by the dispute between Settembrini and Naphta, with the other three people just playing the role of onlookers, occasionally who were occasionally throwing in a new prompt at the two quarrelers in throwing a prompt at them into the arena where just in case when the discussion seems to stall or when they feel personally involved or touched by the topics discussed. I think that the structure of this subchapter is quite interesting. It consists, or it's made up of a total of 4 different blocks or elements. The first block, it's about 10 pages long. This is the part that describes Leo Naphta's bio, and this is presented to us by the narrator as if it were the content of, or a summary of several conversations that have taken place between Hans and Naphta. And so this is sort of a summary, a wrap up of these several talks that happened between them, and each of them he learned some parts of this bio, and this is where it's all put together. And then there's a second block, and I find this one very interesting because this is the block that begins with these things and more. Depending on your translation, maybe it's slightly different. And this second block, it spans about 4 pages, and essentially this part anticipates already the main content and the key topics and the key statements of the subsequent long debate. And so this is a block that is summarizing in advance for the reader the fundamental aspects of Naphta's and Settembrini's positions. So that if you lose track in the debate between the two, which can very easily happen, it could be helpful just to flip back to these 3 to 4 pages to remind yourself what this great colloquium on health and sickness is all about. There's a few key statements here that set the tone for that give the tone of the complete debate. I think Naphta's viewpoint and the worldview becomes very clear when he reports on the sort of warrior monks of the Middle Ages that were ascetic to the point of exhaustion and yet full of spiritual lust or will for power, monks who did not spare blood in order to bring about the theocracy, and were fighting for the world domination by the supernatural. So we learn from this statement alone, we see that Naphta rejects everything that emphasizes the value of the material world, of the human perspective. For him, the supernatural, the fighting for the divine, that this is the highest value. The here and now, the human dignity, human reasoning, the physical world, health, happiness, humanism, all this means nothing to him, and he is really prepared to fight it literally to death. The third section then that is spanning approximately 20 pages, and this is the debate between Settembrini and Naphta, but it's also a commentary on the debate. This debate in which Settembrini attacks Naphta's position from many different angles and perspectives, but also Settembrini himself, he takes quite a beating in this process. Because Naphta is, as it is called sometimes, he has a malicious elegance of thought, and he's a master of both sophistry and also exaggeration to the extreme, and extrapolating any argument to the extreme, to the monstrous. And so this section is also not completely uniform. Sometimes the dispute is reported or almost reproduced almost in the form of the minutes of a meeting, or like a direct recording of the dialogue, and sometimes the main arguments are just given in an abridged form in indirect speech, and sometimes the dispute between the two is reported in a rather indirect mode, in an abstract and detached mode, and sometimes it's also commented on or even judged by the narrator. And so what I found interesting is that the more the conversation progresses, the more the narrator seems to distance and to detach himself from the two opponents. The narrator shifts to an almost mocking, ironic undertone. Oh, this Mr. Settembrini, it was not for nothing that he was a man of letters. He is very generous with his criticism and his beautiful thoughts about emancipation. And then he's whistling at the girls on the street. And so this is sort of this ironic mockery tone creeps in the more the discussion progresses. And so I think the role of this narrator voice is quite interesting. It could be worth for a second reading of the section, could be worth focusing less on the actual topics and the debate, but more by taking a closer look at how the narrator's attitude changes, both towards the two disputants and also towards their arguments and their position. I think there's a lot going on here that you might miss in a first reading. And in the course of the story, the narrator also increasingly evaluates the coherence of the argumentation. So he says something like, "So okay, everything was very mixed up. It was not only against each other, but also mixed up, and the disputants not only they contradicted each other, but they also contradicted themselves." So he notices this, that they are becoming more entangled in the contradictions of their own arguments. And he finally concludes that it's just a great confusion at the end. And yes, great confusion. This is what the final and fourth part of the section is all about. Great confusion. This is what Hans Castorp feels when he returns to his balcony and he looks back on this debate. Hans Castorp, this young man in search of orientation in very turbulent times, he has found no foothold at all, no answers, no orientation, even after more than 600 pages in this novel, and after listening to all these wise men debating at a very high intellectual and rhetorical level. In the end, Hans Castorp, his ears full of the confusion and noise of the weapons of these two armies approaching each other from Jerusalem and from Babylon, meeting in this confused battle. He just feels nothing else, just this great confusion. Okay, so let me conclude this section of the video with a few words about the three onlookers who are accompanying the dispute. They do not contribute much, but still we can see huge differences between the three and the way how they contribute and what they contribute. So then, first of all, there's Hans, of course, and I think Hans is the only one who really tries to follow the entire course of the discussion. Sometimes he tries to contribute something by supposedly original interjections or suggestions, but these are all dismissed by the two disputants as being rather obscure or irritating or off the point. Then there's Mr. Ferge, and I think he's a rather comical figure. He's a person with just one single topic in his life. This is the single topic is his traumatic surgical experience and this so-called pleural shock. And he always speaks up whenever there's any connection to this experience. It may be even very far-fetched, or as soon as he sees any opportunity to make a link to this traumatic experience, he starts to make it. Then he is very reliable, just like a jack in the box. He reliably jumps out of his box in lightning speed and makes a short comment about the relation to his traumatic experience, and then he, he collapses more or less. And so otherwise, on all other topics, he has no opinion at all. I think this is all far beyond his his intellectual horizon and above his pay grade and so on. And then there's Mr. Wesal, and yeah, he always seems to wake up from his mental slumber when it comes to anything related to cruelty. So torture, corporal punishment, beating, the death penalty. These are the topics that suddenly bring him to life, and then he starts making remarks or showing any vital signs. And so this is a bit unsettling, I think. So as I said, for me, he's a very dubious, unsettling, shady character. I don't like him at all. Okay, let's move on to the second point of that video. So what new information do we learn about Naphta? Okay, so I'm not going to rerun in detail the whole content of the first 10 pages. So I hope you have read it yourselves. I would just like to summarize it very briefly, and then I would like to highlight a few points that I find interesting. Okay, so we learned that Naphta is of Jewish origin. He became a half orphan at a very early age, and he caught the attention of a Jesuit priest with his intelligence, and he converted to Catholicism, and he began a career within the Jesuit order, but he was blocked in his career by his illness. So he ended up at the level of a subdeacon, and he will not get the final promotion as a priest. So, and what I find interesting, first and foremost, is this emphasis on his Eastern European or Eastern Jewish background. He grew up on the border of a region that is called Volhynia and Galicia. So this was a classic settlement area for the so-called Ashkenazi Jews or Eastern European Jews, and this is a region which is now um, belongs to three different countries: to the southeast of Poland, to western Ukraine, and to how is it called, Belarus. I think the most famous or most well-known town in this area is the today Ukrainian town of Lviv or Lvov. In I'm sure I'm mispronouncing the name terribly. Back in that time, this part belonged to Austria, to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the city was called Lemberg. And this, in Austrian time, this was a real stronghold of Jewish life and of the Yiddish language. Around the year 1900, about a third of the population of the city and of that area was Jewish. So that's a real high percentage, more than 30%. So why I'm emphasizing this Eastern European and Eastern Jewish origin? I think here now we see that suddenly there's a reappearance of this motive of the contrast between the East and the West. This is now taken up again. This contrast between East and West was very obvious and very present in the first chapters of the novel, with the West as symbolizing the sober, rational, supposedly progressive, but also sort of restless element, sometimes also viewed with suspicion by the narrator because of the loftiness and airiness of the ideas. But on the other hand, the East as sometimes supposedly a bit backward looking, but also the more stable, the more sensually appealing element, also representing contemplation and timelessness. And then this motive of this contrast between East and West has been a bit below the surface, in the previous chapters, but now it's reappearing. From the very outset, Settembrini was modeled or conceived as the representative of the West, and this is, I think, Settembrini as the figure of the West that runs consistently throughout the novel. With the representation of the East, we have a kind of relay race. So first it's Dr. Krokowski with his slight Eastern German accent. Then the East is represented, of course, by Claudia Chauchat. And after her departure, now we need another Eastern European counterpart to the Western Settembrini. And now here we have him in the form and in the person of this Leo Naphta. And small spoiler, he will not be the last representative of the East and the North. Second, interesting. So I think we can expect that we have again more emphasis on this East-West contrast and contradiction. Second interesting point: Leo Naphta grew up as the son of a so-called shochet. That's in the Jewish community, a shochet is a man responsible for slaughtering animals in accordance with the Jewish regulations and traditions. And so this is a very special connection between blood and death and religion. So this viewpoint of killing as a sacred act, this combination of piety on the one hand, but also merciless cruelty on the other hand. This I think this is a very special connection, and this seems that seems to be motive that had a profound influence on the young Leo Naphta. We see this on many levels, even in the objects that he's surrounded with. I think the narrator has already suggested this connection between Naphta and blood in several times. So the color red is present everywhere in Naphta's room or in his apartment, in the furniture, on the walls, and then there's this strange statue of Mary and the dead and blood-stained Christ. So the color of blood is everywhere. Yes, Naphta is strongly connected to blood. And so for Naphta's way of thinking, this connection of bloodshed and religion, that seems to be very central element, seems to be an almost very, a very compelling connection. The whole idea that, okay, conscious killing may be cruel, but on the other hand, it is a just and a godly act. It's so there's a special combination of this piety and merciless cruelty, a ritualized and religiously justified form of violence and killing. And I think this ruthless or merciless cruelty, I think this is a label that generally fits Naphta very well. And I would also use it to describe his attitude towards his siblings, how he treats them after the death of the father and the mother. So, and after he has been taken care of by the Jesuits, he displays an almost social Darwinistic coldness towards his siblings. They're not as smart as he is, so he simply leaves them to the state's welfare system, and that's it. And the third point, I think there seems to be kind of a tradition in this Naphta family of thinking and acting in a very unconventional and idiosyncratic way. We can already see this in Naphta's father, Eli Naphta, who was not only a shochet, but he also worked as a learned man, as somebody who studied the Holy Scriptures, and he had his own interpretation of the Jewish scriptures. And he did not shy away from doing things that were, for his community, almost scandalous. It is reported by the narrator that Naphta's father also worked as a healer, someone who tries to heal people, using his own rituals that involved incantations and prayers, but also blood. And this is really a red flag, because blood is considered very an unclean element in Judaism. So it must not be consumed, must not be eaten under any circumstances. And contact with blood requires a special cleansing. And so against this background, if someone is talking about healing rituals that are involving blood, so this is at least very strange and unconventional at best. So maybe even scandalous or even heretic. So and from the Orthodox Jewish viewpoint. So there's a readiness to do things that are socially unacceptable, even scandalous, for the sake of one's own ideas and convictions. And I think this might be a typical trait in the family. So I know if we're trying to judge the harshness and the cruelty of Naphta and of his positions against this background, against this bio and this family background. I say maybe from a layman's psychological perspective, this could probably be understood or explained partly as the result of some bitterness over the multiple rejection and dismissal and disappointment that he has experienced in his life. So there was rejection because of his ethnic and religious origin, of his Jewishness. His father was killed and the family had to flee. There was rejection because of his own intellect, his own viewpoint. So he was cast out by the district rabbi. And then there was rejection or dismissal because of his illness. So he has to remain a subdeacon. He will not be ordained as a priest. So um, this is, I think, maybe these are elements that could explain a little bit and help us better understand the more unsettling character traits of this Naphta. And on the more about this final comment on the details of this bio. Um, I think it might be worth or interesting to mention that the places that are mentioned here, the places that shaped Naphta's fate, they actually exist. So in the Austrian province of Vorarlberg, there was indeed a Jesuit college called Stella Matutina, which means morning star, and this was located in the town of Feldkirch, and in this town of Feldkirch in Austria, there was actually a hill called Margaretenkapf. So this is a hill with a viewpoint over the Rhine Valley, and so the very spot where the young Leo Naphta met for the first time this supportive father Unterpörtinger on a park bench. So these are places that do actually exist. Okay, so Thomas Mann didn't invent all this. He just used elements that he knew about. Okay, let's move on to the third point, the topics and the course of the dispute. These debates between Settembrini and Naphta, they are somewhat daunting for many readers. But I think we have already successfully tried to bring a little structure into these discussions in two previous videos, in the video number 15 and 16. And in this video, I will try to pick up on this. I will go one step further. And I have prepared for this video so a table where I have summarized the topics that have played a major role in the discussions between Settembrini and Naphta so far. And I think with such an overview at hand, it's easier to resume our analysis of this and to remind ourselves on what has been talked about, and then also this overview, this table might help to easier grasp and understand the content of the current dispute. At least I hope that it will be helpful in that way. Okay, so the table is structured in a way that the first column always gives the main topic that is being discussed, and then the second and the third column, they give and compare the positions that Settembrini and Naphta take on this topic. And of course, they always take diametrically opposed positions. So I will first highlight the first 5 topics that we already know from previous discussions between the two. So the first one is a very fundamental question about the main principle of the world. So what is the relation between the material world and the spiritual world, so between matter and nature on the one hand, and the world of ideas and spirit, including the supernatural. And we had established in previous discussions that Settembrini is more a proponent of a position that is called monism. So that means that there's only one single common principle behind the entire world. Whereas Naphta advocates for a double dualism. On the one hand, he sees a dualism in that sense that he sees the world clearly divided into matter on the one hand and spirit on the other hand. And uh, even within the spiritual world, he sees this spiritual part of the world again clearly divided into two opposing forces, into a good and an evil principle. So, in Christian terminology, God and the devil, and this very polar, dualistic thinking. I think this is a very fundamental element of his thinking in general. It's a fundamental element of his worldview that runs through his position on all different topics and themes. I think in one at one point in one of the early conversation, he also said to see the world as divided, that is real spirit. So that's the central point. Always looking for the divide, looking for diametrically opposed forces or positions. The second point is that it's another constant point of conflict between the two, and this stems from the so-called philosophical dispute over the universal things. So the key question is, are there such things as timeless and eternally valid ideas? Even if there were no world and no humans at all, would these sort of ideas and principles still exist? And Settembrini says no, that he sees them clearly as just the result of human reason or human reasoning. And for Naphta, there are these timeless and eternally valid ideas. And of course, for him, they are all of divine origin. The third point is on the subject of work or leisure. Settembrini considers work in the service of humanity as a very one of the highest ideals, or as a very very high ideals. And yeah, we notice. I think this is very uh, understandable, and we know now that he is a member of all kinds of international leagues and alliances and initiatives for improving the world. So if there's a league for um, abolishing torture and abolishing the death punishment and etc. So he is a real activist. And for Naphta, that this sort of human activism is nothing but arrogance and hubris, and it's even sinful, because God alone is the one who does everything that is truly necessary to the world and that is truly good. And so again, a clear, complete opposition between the two. And the fourth point on the question of matters related to social order and to the state and society. And so there's this choice between pacifism and freedom on the one hand, or war and terror on the other hand. And of course, Settembrini fights for pacifism and for freedom, human rights, society, the state. Everything must be arranged in a way so that it ultimately serves humanity and human values. And for Naphta, this is pure blasphemy. Of course, for him, everything must serve not humanity, but the greater glory of God. And this is also um, clearly understandable from his perspective. But he's a Jesuit, and the main motto of the Jesuit order is omnia ad majorem Dei gloriam. So the Latin, that means everything for the greater glory of God. So that's the key objective. That's the key principle. And for Naphta, this means that even war and terror are justified if they serve the greater glory of God, or if they serve to promote the goals of religion or the establishment, the foundation of a theocracy. And okay, on the fifth point, also what we learned from previous discussions is on the question whether religion or reason should determine our actions and our thinking. Uh, the difference between the two is, I think, it's no longer surprising at all. Human reason is the measure of all things for Settembrini, while for Naphta, of course, the only thing that counts is God's will and being obedient to God's will. So, at first glance, all of this seems relatively clear, and very clear positions on very well-defined topics. But what makes the discussion between the two sometimes so exhausting is that they're not staying at the surface. They delve into the depth at each point, and then they 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 extrapolate and speculate about these positions, and they also they expose the weaknesses, the most subtle contradictions and weaknesses in the others' arguments with a really surgical precision, and this deep dive into the topics that makes things complex, and this sometimes creates confusion. Because if you just dive deep enough with each of these positions, you will notice that there you run into trouble. For example, you will not be able to justify your position down to the last detail, and it's virtually impossible to find for any of these positions an ultimate and unquestionable justification. In the end, they all rely on certain assumptions, or that are either speculative or they are partly just consensus-based assumptions. And yeah, so it's really difficult to justify everything up to a final point that is more or less unquestionable, a real solid foundation. You might give it a try by just trying to construct a solid chain of reasoning and arguments as to why human reason should be the measure of all things. So I think you quickly come to a point where it's not easy to provide an additional justification. And yeah, a second point is that once you start to be really strict and consistent and think each of these positions through to the extreme, you extrapolate also the consequences of these positions to the extreme, then you can quickly become entangled in contradictions. So, and this can be very easily. So, if you try to explain the existence of evil with the concept of monism, and it's already starting to begin to might be hard. And then, if you would try to explain and justify, then if this is just the result, even good and evil is the result of one principle, why should one fight against the evil? Um, this position might become contradictory in itself. Or yeah, how can one justify that there is such a thing as the divine, or that human reason should be the measure of all things? And if there's no extra human or supernatural justification for it, one might quickly end up in sort of a circular argument that is then easily to be dismissed. How can pacifism and freedom for all people be established and protected without any coercion and violence and force? And how can one justify a theocracy if humans are really bad and sinful and irrelevant anyway, and only the supernatural world of the spirit is the only thing that counts? So why should one even bother about establishing a theocracy to rule these human beings who are irrelevant anyway? So okay, so it's very easy to run into contradictions, and they are doing so, and that makes the discussion sometimes a bit tedious to follow, and can be a bit exhaustive. So yeah, Settembrini and Naphta, they attack all these weaknesses in the opposing position in a merciless way, and with great zeal, and which sometimes makes it a little bit difficult to follow the discussion. But it's not hopeless. I think, for example, if you use this diagram, this table, to remind yourself from time to time what the discussion is actually about and what the positions of the two counterparts actually are. So these were the the 5 topics that we already are familiar with from the previous discussions, and they play a role also in this discussion. But now some new element and some new perspective is on the table, and this discussion is about the value of life and also illness. And that's why I've added also these points to the table: the value of illness, the nature of human beings, and also the value of the body and the value of human life in general. These are four new points, but they are closely linked to the previous ones, and in the discussion they will be referenced to the previous ones. So all 9 points are at some point relevant in this discussion, in this dispute. So this is why I think also this table could be helpful to place it next to the book. If you're rereading this dispute, it might be helpful. So let's go through the points that pop up in this discussion again. So the starting point of all this debate is the report on the death of poor Karen Karstedt. You may remember Karen, this young woman whom Joachim and Hans cared for a while, taking her to the movies and to a cafe. And now she has died. And Settembrini recalls this phase of Hans and Joachim's charity work a couple of months ago, and he ridicules it somewhat, because to him, to Settembrini, this seems like paying too much attention to illness, giving too much value to it, because for him, illness is something like a moral flaw, something to be fought against. Of course, Naphta has to see things quite differently. For Naphta, illness is good, um, because on the one hand, it is a just punishment for us sinful human beings, and on the other hand, it also enables other people to make good works of charity. And so, and this is what ignites the whole dispute, and then which concerns these topics 6 to 9 listed here. So it's about the value of illness, and then it moves on to about the value of human nature. And Settembrini has a very positive view of humanity, but he admits that humans can be evil, they can do bad things, but they are evil only through their actions. But for Naphta, the evilness of human nature, it is rooted in its very being, in its very nature. So man is evil. He has or she has a thoroughly sinful nature, and it is evil by nature, and not just in case we do bad things. And also the value of the human body is equally controversial between the two. For Settembrini, the body is something natural and something good. And he even goes so far as to use an almost biblical phrase, presumably to beat Naphta on his own in his own game. So theology. So he says that the body is a temple of God. That's an almost biblical quote. I think somewhere in the New Testament it said that the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. So that indicates for Settembrini that the body is clearly something that ought to be protective. And maybe there's need to admonish and to train the body from time to time, but in a kind manner. But for Naphta, the sinful nature of humanity means that the body is also just sinful flesh, and it deserves nothing but chastisement and punishment. And ultimately, this leads also to a fundamentally different assessment of human life, and above all, also the individual, the human life of the individual. For Settembrini, life is an end in itself. It's a precious commodity that is worth protecting for its own sake. For Naphta, individual life has no value at all. Everything is for the greater glory of God. And for Naphta, this means that also an individual life can be sacrificed and annihilated at any time if this serves higher religious needs or ideals. And human life can be annihilated without much ado. So we see that that's the yeah, how different, how completely different the worldview of these two opponents is on almost every topic. And I hope that this systematic structure helps a little bit if you lose track in the discussion of the two. And this might be helpful to regain an overview of what the two are actually talking about, and above all, to understand also how contradictory and how irreconcilable these two positions are. So there will never be a consensus between the two. That becomes very clear if you see how different their positions are. It's difficult to think of opponents who are further apart in their positions. So I think the point is an important point in the way these discussions are described here is that both of them are depicted as such good debaters and so rhetorically skilled that the discussion always seems like a stalemate to the reader. Neither position seems to gain the upper hand, and the reader and especially Hans is and remains unable to decide who is right and who is wrong. And so at the end, Hans is just as clueless as before, perhaps even more so, because in the end, all that remains is just the impression of a great confusion and a great bewilderment. Okay, let's move on to the fourth point. So what's the point of it all? Why all this discussion here at this point in the novel? I think it might be helpful to remind ourselves about the very first videos where I talked about the main topic of the novel. The novel is mainly about a young man who is not yet established and not yet fully mature, and who is rather disoriented in terms of his worldview, and a young man who lives in a time when previous certainties and beliefs are crumbling, and so he's a young man who is searching for ideological support and orientation and for a clear worldview. And this feeling of old values crumbling away, this feeling of disorientation in the face of many competing new ideologies and worldviews, this was the reality at the onset of World War One, when the time when Hans is at the Berghof, but it was even more pronounced at the time when Thomas Mann wrote the novel, particularly when he resumed work on the novel after the end of the First World War, and this was also a fundamental feeling among his readership in the early 20s when the novel was published. The old order, especially in Germany, the monarchy, the empire, the Kaiser, the Prussian values, the clear social order with farmers, workers, bourgeoisie, and nobility, the certainties of the Christian faith and the moral rules, the role of the state and the church. All of this had been swept away by World War One and then by the revolution and by the new political ideas. There was a young democracy, but it was not really consolidated. There were also plenty of other and much more radical political ideas from the left to the right who were propagating completely different worldviews from partly anarchistic, partly dictatorial forms of state and society, and were trying to present alternatives also to the young and new democracy. And and all these many of these new ideas had already been present shortly before World War One, but the more so after World War One. So Hans Castorp is presented to us as a prototype of the young generation who are experiencing this breakdown of old ideas, who are completely disoriented, so and are unsure what values, what ideology should I base my life on. And it's ranges from the political question down to the very personal one. So is it preferable to live or to die? Is What is the value of illness or health? Should we live a life of love and lust, or of asceticism? Should we be guided by reason or by emotion? Should we strike for work or leisure, pleasure or spirit or education? So what is right, what is wrong? And at the end of this section, it becomes clear to Hans that even with these two self-proclaimed spiritual leaders, these wise men and learned men, Settembrini and Naphta, they have no clear answer, no convincing answer. They don't have a ready-made answer for poor Hans Castorp. He will have to continue um, go on searching, perhaps within himself, or perhaps outside in the world around him, in nature, who knows. So maybe that's why the next thing we will see in the novel is a walk or a hike of Hans Castorp alone in the snow. So the next subchapter is sure to be a very exciting and interesting one. In my opinion, the narrator has really done a good and clever job of convincing us that these self-proclaimed spiritual leaders of this world, they do not have any truly helpful and convincing answer to offer, and we have to continue our search. Okay, so we'll do that in the next chapter, but before coming to the end, I would like to make a short fifth point on the role models for this interesting character, Naphta. So that's may be a lot of information on very detailed German historical background, but maybe this is interesting even for non-German readers and viewers. As I just mentioned, that the novel was written at a time when in Europe and especially in Germany there was a wide variety of worldviews and political systems that were presenting themselves as a panacea, as a miracle cure for all societal challenges and deficits. And especially in the years between 1900 and the 1920s, many new ideas, and some of them very radical ones, many new ideas about how a society or a state should function, they sprouted like mushrooms. They were popping up everywhere. And so there was a huge variety of these ideas, from the extreme right to the extreme left. So from militant atheism to what today seems like a bizarre combination of militant Christian tinged communism, like the type that Naphta is sometimes representing, and also to the extreme fascism, extreme right. And so almost every possible political idea that you could think of, and on an ideological idea, an idea about how a society and a family even should function, that was present in the public debate. And some of them were even presented by very fascinating public figures as main proponents of these ideas and ideologies. And Thomas Mann, he was a very keen observer of the public and political life and of all these new ideas, and he drew on this rich source of material and ideas and also of fascinating figures and proponents, and he did so especially in the construction of this character of Naphta. So Naphta is not built on one single person. It is sometimes said that the Marxist literary critic and philosopher Georg Lukács was the model for Naphta, but that's only a small part of the truth. Lukács was probably a model for Naphta's physiognomy, so for his outward appearance and for the style of his speech and of his argumentation, because he had a very specific way of talking and making his argument, that seemed to be very convincing. As soon as he was talking, you didn't notice the flaws in his argument. So Thomas Mann said about Georg Lukács one time, as long as he spoke, he was right. So and so this is what Thomas Mann supposedly said about Georg Lukács, and this is sometimes also true for Naphta. But if it sounds very convincing, and if you take a step back and think about his positions, you see the weak points and the atrocities behind it. However, so Georg Lukács might have been a model for the outward appearance and for the way of talking and for the style of argumentation, but all these specific positions that Naphta represents, that they cannot be attributed to Georg Lukács, at least only a small fraction of them. And so here clearly other people were at the source of inspiration for Thomas Mann. We do not know for sure. He didn't leave a report on that, but so there are some indicators that some people, he was very familiar with them and their way of thinking, and they have strong similarities with Naphta. And so I did some cherry picking from the the literature on the Magic Mountain, and to mention a few of them. So one is the type of it's not a specific person, but it's a type, a prototype of a person that's described by Friedrich Nietzsche, by the German philosopher, the figure of a type of the ascetic priest. And then there was a German writer, Max Steiner, who, like Naphta, was a convert from Judaism to Catholicism, and also was a strong proponent for anti-Enlightenment positions. Then there was a political figure and also a writer, Gustav Landauer, an anarchist who also advocated strongly the idea of medieval type communism. And then there was the Russian writer Sergei Bulgakov, who wrote a description of a prototype of the Russian revolutionary young man. And he described this Russian revolution as an explosive mixture of Jewish intellectual radicalism and Slavic Christian worship. So you see the similarities to Naphta's viewpoints. Then there was a specific German writer called Ludwig Derleth, who published a pamphlet or a poem collection, Proclamations, and there he called for a holy war in a bizarre mixture of religiosity and cruelty, and he wanted to establish a kingdom of Christ on earth, and he wanted to establish this by means of terror and bloodshed. And Thomas Mann was fascinated by this Ludwig Derleth. He also used him to create the writer, the poet Daniel Zuhöhe in his novel Dr. Faust. And I personally would also like to include another person called Ernst Toller, who's also a writer and a political activist. And he and Thomas Mann, they knew each other. They frequented the same circle established by a Munich literary scholar called Arthur Kutscher. And like Naphta, this Ernst Toller was of Eastern Jewish origin. He had to interrupt his education, his professional training due to illness, and he was also a strong supporter of socialist, communist, revolutionary ideas, and also played an important role in the Munich Soviet Republic in 1990. Okay, so yeah, that much of this must be sort of speculative, but I think for me, I wanted to make the point that there was no single person who served as a role model for Naphta. Rather, Thomas Mann drew on the proponents of various radical political and ideological movements of the time, and he merged some of their most interesting ideas and character traits of some of their proponents in this single character, Naphta. So that's it for today. I hope that my thoughts were somewhat clear and helpful, and I will look forward to your additions, to your questions and your suggestions in the comments. Next time, probably in 2 weeks from now, in mid-September, we will take a look at the 7th part of the 6th chapter, the subchapter entitled Snow. So, and this is certainly one of the most famous and well-known episodes of the novel, and this will be just a hike of Hans, without Settembrini, without Naphta, just Hans Castorp traveling through the snow-covered mountains of the Swiss Alps. It sounds idyllic, but I think it will still be quite exciting, maybe even a little bit eerie or unsettling. Okay, until then, I wish you all the best and an enjoyable reading. Take care, bye-bye, and ciao.